The lone rancher finds the beautiful Apache woman wounded and hidden beneath a scorched cedar, moments before a band of raiders circle back to finish their hunt. His horse had smelled the blood first, nostrils flaring, ears pinned back against the desert wind that carried death and smoke across the mesa. The rancher pulled the reins tight, squinting against the late afternoon glare that turned everything to brass and shadow. 3 days of tracking stolen cattle had brought him to this burned-out grove where lightning had struck weeks before, leaving the trees skeletal and black against the rust-colored earth. He saw the boot print first, then the drag marks, then the dark stain in the sand. The rancher dismounted in silence, his hand moving to the Winchester slung across his back. His eyes swept the landscape, the distant rock formations, the shimmering heat rising from the flats, the buzzards circling a half-mile east. Everything in him said to ride on. This wasn't his fight. This was Apache country, and white men who went looking for trouble here usually found graves instead. But something made him kneel beside that blood trail. Something made him follow it to the scorched cedar. She was pressed into the hollow beneath the twisted roots, her body folded small and still, her dark hair matted with sand and dried blood. For a heartbeat, he thought she was dead until her eyes opened. Black as obsidian, fierce even through the haze of pain and fever, they locked onto his with an intensity that stopped his breath. She didn't speak, didn't plead, just watched him with those eyes that held more fire than fear. The rancher saw the wound, then a rifle shot, high on her left shoulder, the bullet still lodged somewhere in the meat and muscle. Her doeskin dress was soaked through, her bronze skin slick with sweat despite the shade. She'd wrapped it with strips torn from her sleeve, but the bleeding hadn't stopped. She'd been here hours, maybe more, waiting for death or darkness. He heard the riders before he saw them. The sound came from the east, carried on that same hot wind hoofbeats and men's voices, rough and eager. The rancher's jaw tightened. He glanced back at the Apache woman, then at his horse standing 20 yards away, then at the open ground between the cedar grove and the nearest cover. They'd never make it. The woman's hand moved to the knife at her belt, a small blade, probably dull, certainly useless against rifles. Her eyes never left his face. She was calculating too, measuring him, deciding if he was another enemy or something else entirely. The rancher made his choice in the space between heartbeats. He shrugged out of his duster and laid it over her, covering that blood-soaked dress, hiding her beneath the sun-faded canvas. Then he stood and walked out to meet the riders, putting himself between them and the cedar tree, his rifle held loose and ready across his chest. 5 men came up over the rise hard-faced and trail-dirty, their horses lathered and mean. The leader wore a cavalry jacket with the insignia torn off, and a hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much killing to care about one more. He reined up 30 feet away, his hand resting easy on his thigh close to his pistol. The rancher didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the dying light like a piece of the landscape itself, weathered and immovable. The leader spat tobacco juice into the sand. His eyes swept the grove, lingering on the rancher's horse, the burned trees, the undisturbed dust, looking for tracks, looking for blood, looking for the Apache woman they'd been hunting since dawn. Time stretched thin as wire. Then the leader's gaze came back to the rancher, and something passed between them, an understanding as old as the frontier itself. This could go quiet or it could go loud, but either way, somebody wasn't riding away. The rancher's thumb moved to the hammer of his Winchester. Almost lazy, almost careless. The leader smiled, but it never reached his eyes. He lifted his reins, turning his horse's head south, and the others followed. But as they rode past, the one at the back looked over his shoulder, looked right at that scorched cedar, and the rancher saw the knowledge dawn in his face. They'd be coming back. The rancher waited until the dust settled and the hoofbeats faded into the vast indifference of the desert. Then he moved fast. He brought his horse to the cedar, pulled the woman out of her hiding place with more gentleness than he'd shown any living thing in 3 years, and lifted her into the saddle. She swayed, barely conscious, her fingers clutching the pommel with desperate strength. He swung up behind her, pulled her back against his chest to keep her from falling, and turned north toward country even God seemed to have forgotten. Behind them, the sun dropped toward the mountains, spilling blood-red light across the wasteland. And somewhere in that dying glow, 5 riders circled back. The rancher's cabin sat in a box canyon 15 miles north of the scorched cedar grove, hidden among red rock formations that rose like broken teeth from the desert floor. He'd built it himself after the war, after the fever took his wife and daughter, after everything that mattered had turned to ash in his hands. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace, a corral for the horse, and a spring that ran cold even in August. It was enough. More than he deserved. He brought the Apache woman there as night swallowed the last of the daylight. She'd passed out 2 hours into the ride, her body going slack against his, her breathing shallow and fast. He could feel the fever burning through her skin, feel the sticky warmth of fresh blood seeping through her dress where the rough movement had reopened the wound. Every instinct told him she wouldn't last till morning, that he was carrying a corpse across the desert, that all he'd done was delay the inevitable. But he kept riding. Inside the cabin, he laid her on his bed, the only bed, and lit the oil lamp. In its amber glow, she looked younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with the kind of beauty that made men start wars and ruin civilizations. High cheekbones, full lips parted with each labored breath, a face that combined fierce pride with something softer, something that survival hadn't quite burned away. The rancher forced himself to look at the wound instead. He'd dug bullets out of men before, back when he wore a different uniform and believed in different things. The war had taught him field medicine the hard way, how to cut, how to cauterize, how to tell the difference between a man who'd lived through the night and one who'd be dead by dawn. This was bad. He built up the fire and set water to boil, found the whiskey and the leather strap, laid out his knife and the long tweezers he used for pulling thorns from the horse's hooves. Not proper medical tools, but the frontier didn't offer proper anything. You made do or you died. The woman stirred as he cut away the doeskin around the wound, her eyes fluttering open, unfocused. She saw the knife in his hand and tried to pull away, her right hand grasping for the blade at her belt, gone now, taken when he'd lifted her onto the horse. The rancher caught her wrist, gentle but firm. She fought him with what strength she had left, which wasn't much, her body arching off the bed, a low sound escaping her throat that might have been a word in her language or might have been pure animal defiance. He pressed his hand to her uninjured shoulder, held her still, and waited until her eyes focused on his face. Then he picked up the whiskey bottle and took a long pull himself, showing her, before offering it to her lips. She understood. Drank deep, coughed, drank again. The rancher folded the leather strap and placed it between her teeth. She bit down hard, her jaw set, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made something twist in his chest. Not trust, exactly, but recognition. She knew what was coming, knew what it would cost. Knew she had no choice but to endure. He worked fast and sure. The bullet had gone deep, lodged against the shoulder blade, and getting it out meant cutting through muscle already swollen and infected. She didn't scream, just bit down on the leather until her teeth creaked, her body rigid, sweat pouring down her face and neck. When he finally pried the flattened slug free and dropped it clinking into the tin bowl, she went limp, unconscious again, her breathing ragged. The rancher cleaned the wound with whiskey and packed it with honey from his meager stores, an old trick his grandmother had taught him, back when the world was younger and less cruel. Then he bandaged her with strips torn from his only clean shirt and covered her with every blanket he owned. For 3 days, she burned with fever. The rancher kept the fire going, changed the bandages, spooned water and thin broth between her lips whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. He slept in the chair by the hearth, his rifle across his lap, listening for hoofbeats that never came, but would, eventually. Those riders hadn't given up. Men like that never did. They'd search every canyon, every box draw, every hidden spring between here and the territorial line. On the fourth morning, the fever broke. The rancher woke to find her watching him from the bed, her dark eyes clear and alert, tracking his movements as he built up the fire and set coffee to boil. She didn't speak, and he realized she probably didn't speak English, or chose not to. But when he brought her water, she drank it all, and when he helped her sit up to eat, she didn't fight him. The wound was healing clean. Against all odds, against all his expectations, she was going to live. Over the next week, the rancher learned her rhythms. She was strongest in the morning, able to sit up on her own, even stand for brief moments with her hand braced against the wall. By afternoon, the pain would drag her back down, and she'd sleep for hours in the golden light that slanted through the window, her face peaceful in ways it never was when she was awake. He learned that she was left-handed, that she favored her right leg when she walked, that she had a scar on her ribs shaped like a crescent moon. He learned that she was modest, pulling the blankets up when he needed to check the bandages, but not shy, meeting his eyes steadily, without the downcast submission some white men expected from Indian women. She learned him too. Watched how he moved through the cabin with economical grace, how he cleaned his rifle with the same careful attention he gave to changing her dressings, how he stared into the fire at night with the expression of a man haunted by ghosts he couldn't outrun. Neither spoke, but a language grew between them anyway. Built from gestures and glances, from the rancher's rough gentleness when he helped her walk across the room, from the way she relaxed when he came through the door at dusk with fresh water from the spring. On the 8th day, he returned from checking the horse to find her standing at the window, looking out at the red rock formations painted gold by the setting sun. She'd managed to dress herself in one of his shirts, far too large, hanging to her knees, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her hair hung loose down her back, still damp from where she'd washed it in the basin. The rancher stopped in the doorway, struck by the sight of her silhouetted against that dying light. For the first time since his wife died, he felt the sharp edge of loneliness that came from knowing something beautiful was temporary. She turned, sensing him there, and something passed between them in the quiet. An acknowledgement, a question neither could ask. Her eyes dropped to the shirt she wore, his shirt, then back to his face, and he saw the faintest color rise in her bronzed cheeks. The rancher looked away first, busying himself with the fire, but he could feel her watching him, could feel the weight of everything unspoken, pressing down on the cabin like the heavy air before a storm. That night, for the first time, she didn't sleep in the bed. He found her curled on the floor by the hearth, wrapped in a single blanket, and when he tried to lift her back to the mattress, she shook her head firmly. She pointed to the bed, then to him, her meaning clear. He'd given up his sleep for 10 days. It was enough. The rancher started to argue, then saw the set of her jaw and knew it was pointless. Instead, he brought her another blanket and built up the fire. As he settled into bed, his bed, which still smelled like her, he heard her breathing even out, heard the soft sound of her shifting to get comfortable on the hard-packed dirt. In the darkness, he spoke aloud for the first time since she'd arrived. Just her name, or what he guessed it might be, the Apache word for starlight he'd heard a scout use once, years ago. He didn't know if he'd said it right. Didn't know if it was even close. But in the ember-glow darkness, he heard her breath catch. Heard the rustle of the blanket as she turned toward him, though neither could see the other through the shadows. And he knew she'd understood. 2 weeks after the rancher found her beneath the scorched cedar, the riders came. He was down at the spring, filling the water skins, when he heard his horse whinny sharp and nervous. Every nerve in his body went electric. He grabbed the rifle and ran back to the cabin, taking the path that kept him hidden among the rocks until he could see the canyon mouth. 5 horses stood outlined against the morning sky. The same 5 riders from the cedar grove, patient and still, studying the cabin from a distance that kept them just out of rifle range. The rancher's heart hammered against his ribs. He glanced back at the cabin, saw the door standing open, saw the Apache woman silhouetted inside, her body tensed like an animal scenting wolves. The leader of the riders nudged his horse forward a few paces, cupped his hands around his mouth. His voice carried clear across the canyon. "A bounty," he shouted. $200 for the Apache woman, alive. Government wanted her for crimes against settlers, for raids on supply trains, for things the rancher didn't believe and wouldn't care about even if they were true. The message was simple. Hand her over and ride away clean. Or die defending a savage who'd slit his throat the first chance she got. The rancher didn't answer. Didn't even show himself. He just waited, his finger resting light on the trigger, his eyes counting the weapons he could see and calculating the ones he couldn't. After 5 long minutes, the leader spat into the dirt and wheeled his horse around. The others followed. But they didn't ride away. They made camp at the canyon mouth, 600 yards out, and built a fire. A siege, then. They'd wait until thirst or hunger forced the rancher's hand, until he had to make a run for it or watch the woman die slow in his cabin. The rancher made it back to the cabin without being seen. Inside, the Apache woman stood with her back pressed to the wall, his spare pistol in her good hand. She'd found it somewhere. His hideout gun, the one he kept for emergencies. Her shoulder was healed enough that she could move without wincing, but not enough to ride hard or fight. She looked at him, and he saw the calculation in her eyes. She was weighing her chances, thinking about slipping out the back in the dark, leading them away from him, maybe dying in the desert, but at least dying free. The rancher crossed to her and slowly, carefully, took the pistol from her hand. Then he did something he couldn't quite explain, even to himself. He touched her face, just his rough fingertips against her cheek, the lightest brush, there and gone, and shook his head. She drew in a sharp breath, her eyes searching his. He couldn't tell her that he'd already lost everyone he'd ever cared about. Couldn't tell her that he'd spent 3 years building this life specifically, so he'd never have to care again. Never have to feel the crushing weight of loss when the world took what little he'd managed to hold on to. Couldn't tell her that somewhere in the past 2 weeks, she'd undone all of it. So he just touched her face again, let his hand linger a moment longer, and hoped she understood. Then he started making plans for a running fight through country that wanted them both dead. They left at midnight. The rancher had spent the day preparing loading ammunition, packing food and water, checking every cinch and buckle on his horse's tack. The Apache woman moved through the cabin like a ghost, gathering the few things worth taking, his hunting knife, the small pouch of gold coins hidden under the floorboards, strips of dried venison. She'd bound her shoulder tight with fresh bandages and fashioned a sling from canvas that would keep it immobile when they rode. She'd also done something else. The rancher found her at dusk, crouched by the fire, her fingers working with practiced precision. She'd unraveled the decorative beadwork from her ruined dress and was weaving it into a small band geometric, patterns in turquoise and bone white, the colors of desert sky and sun-bleached stone. When she finished, she held it out to him, a gift, a token, a promise he didn't quite understand. The rancher took it, felt the smooth beads against his calloused palm, and tucked it carefully into his vest pocket, right over his heart. The woman's eyes followed the movement, and something softened in her expression, just for a moment, just enough for him to see that beneath all that fierce survival instinct was a capacity for tenderness she'd learned to hide. When full darkness came, they moved. The rancher led his horse on foot, the woman walking beside him, both of them silent as smoke. They took the back way out of the canyon, a narrow trail that wound up through the rocks to a high mesa treacherous in daylight, damn near suicidal at night. But the moon was bright enough to see by, and the rancher had walked this path 100 times in the years since he'd built the cabin. They reached the top just as voices rose from the canyon below. The riders had discovered the empty cabin, and they weren't pleased. The rancher helped the woman onto the horse, then swung up behind her. She settled back against his chest, her body fitting against his like she'd been designed for exactly that purpose. He tried not to think about how right it felt. Tried not to notice the way her hair smelled like smoke and sage. Tried not to feel the steady beat of her heart beneath his forearm, where it circled her waist to reach the reins. Then he gave the horse its head and they ran. They rode north through country that got meaner with every mile. The high desert gave way to badlands, wind-carved formations of striated rock, dry washes that could flood in minutes if a storm broke, patches of alkali flat that stretched white and sterile under the stars. The rancher knew this land. Had scouted it during the war, had hidden in its canyons, had watched men die of thirst 20 feet from water they couldn't find. The raiders would follow, but they'd be slower, less sure of the ground. That bought time. Not much, but enough. They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to rest the horse and let the woman drink. She never complained, never asked to slow down. Just held on and endured, her body swaying with the horse's rhythm, her good hand occasionally touching the rancher's arm where it wrapped around her, steadying herself, or maybe just confirming he was still there. By the second night, they'd put enough distance between themselves and the raiders that the rancher risked a small fire in a sheltered draw. He made coffee and softened the jerky in boiling water until it was tender enough to chew. The Apache woman ate slowly, her eyes distant, watching the flames dance. The rancher studied her across the fire. The wound was holding, but the hard riding was taking its toll. She looked thinner, hollowed out, the sharp edges of exhaustion cutting into her face. But those eyes were still fierce, still burning with whatever fire kept her alive when other people would have given up. She caught him looking and held his gaze across the flames. The air between them felt charged, heavy with all the things they couldn't say. The rancher felt it in his chest, in his throat, in the pulse jumping at his wrist, this dangerous pull toward her, this sense that something fundamental had shifted in him the moment he'd found her beneath that scorched cedar. The woman rose slowly, wincing as her shoulder protested, and moved around the fire to sit beside him. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel the heat of her body, could see the firelight reflected in her eyes. She reached for his hand, the one bearing the old scar from a saber cut, and traced the raised line with one finger, her touch light and questioning. Then she took his hand and pressed it against her own ribs, against that crescent moon scar he'd noticed weeks ago, letting him feel the story written in her skin. They were both survivors, both marked by violence, both running from things they couldn't change. The rancher let his hand rest there a moment longer than necessary, feeling her breathe, feeling the steady drum of her heart beneath his palm. Then he pulled back, stood, and walked to the edge of their camp to keep watch, because touching her any longer would have led to things neither of them could afford in the middle of the desert, with killers on their trail. But when he glanced back, he saw her watching him with eyes that held the same hunger, the same ache, the same impossible hope. And he knew they were both in trouble of a kind that had nothing to do with bullets or bounties. They found the burned-out homestead 3 days later, rising from the desert floor like a skeleton picked clean by crows. The rancher reined in 100 yards out, his body tense, every instinct screaming danger. Smoke still curled from the collapsed roof, thin and gray against the hard blue sky. Recent then, maybe yesterday, maybe this morning. The Apache woman's hand tightened on his forearm, a warning, a question. She'd gone rigid behind him, her breathing shallow. The rancher studied the scene. Single cabin, good stone well, a corral where 3 horses lay dead in the sun, already bloating in the heat. The door hung open, dark as a mouth. Nothing moved except the smoke and the buzzards circling overhead. He should ride on, should put distance between himself and whatever had happened here. Instead he dismounted, handed the reins to the woman, and approached on foot with his rifle ready. The cabin told the story. Table overturned, dishes smashed, dark stains on the floor that could only be blood. The settlers, a family, judging by the sizes of the boots lined up by the door, were gone. Taken or killed, dragged off or buried somewhere out in the wastes. Raiders, probably. Maybe the same ones hunting the Apache woman, maybe different ones. The frontier was full of men who took what they wanted and left nothing but ash. The rancher found supplies in the root cellar: canned goods, flour, coffee, things worth taking. He found a spare rifle too, older but serviceable, and a box of ammunition. He gathered what he could carry and brought it back to the horse. The Apache woman had dismounted, was standing at the well, looking down into its depths. When he approached, she gestured, and he understood. They needed water, needed to fill their skins for the long push ahead. But she was afraid of what might be down there, afraid of drinking from a well in a place soaked with death. The rancher dropped the bucket and pulled up water. Clear and cold, no smell, no taste of corruption. He drank first, deep, then offered the dipper to her. She drank too, her eyes never leaving his, trusting him to have tested it properly, trusting him with her life in the small ways that mattered more than the grand gestures. They filled the water skins and rode on, leaving the dead homestead behind. But the sight of it had changed something between them, made them both acutely aware of how thin the margin was between survival and destruction, how quickly a life could be erased by violence and fire. That night, camped in a canyon where ancient peoples had carved petroglyphs into the rock, the Apache woman moved closer to the rancher as he kept watch. She sat beside him, her injured shoulder pressed against his good one, and laid her head against his arm, just for a moment, just long enough to share warmth and presence. The rancher didn't pull away, didn't speak. Just sat there feeling her breathe, feeling the impossible fragility of this moment, this connection, this thing growing between them that had no name in his language or hers. The waterhole was supposed to be 2 days north, hidden in a box canyon the rancher had used once before. But when they arrived, they found it guarded, not by raiders, by Apaches. 6 warriors sat their horses at the canyon mouth, painted for war, their faces hard and unreadable in the late afternoon sun. The rancher's heart sank. He'd led them straight into this, thinking he was being clever, thinking he knew the land better than anyone else. The woman behind him went absolutely still. Then she slid from the horse and walked forward before the rancher could stop her. She moved like she was made of courage and fire, her spine straight despite the pain that must have been screaming through her shoulder. The warriors watched her approach, their weapons ready but not raised. Then the leader, an older man with silver threading through his black hair and scars that told stories of 100 battles, swung down from his horse. The rancher couldn't understand the words they exchanged, but he understood the body language. The warrior's initial anger, his sharp gestures toward the rancher, his obvious demand that she return with them and leave the white man to whatever fate he deserved. The woman's firm refusal, her hand moving to rest over her heart, then extending toward the rancher in a gesture that needed no translation. The warrior looked at the rancher then, really looked at him, his dark eyes taking measure. Seeing the weathered face, the careful distance the rancher maintained, the rifle held loose but ready, the way he sat his horse like a man who knew how to fight but didn't want to. What passed between them in that long stare was ancient as the desert itself. Man to man, warrior to warrior, both of them understanding that the woman between them had already made her choice, and blood would spill if either tried to take that choice away from her. Finally, the warrior spoke a single sentence in his own tongue. The woman answered in the same language, her voice steady and clear. The warrior nodded slowly. Then he and his men moved aside, clearing the path to the waterhole. The woman walked back to the rancher, swung onto the horse behind him, and wrapped her good arm around his waist in a grip that said more than words ever could. As they rode past the warriors into the canyon, the rancher felt their eyes on his back, judging, measuring, warning him that if he betrayed the trust this woman had placed in him, there would be no rock to hide behind, no distance far enough to run. At the waterhole, while the horse drank deep and they refilled their skins, the woman finally spoke. Not in English, the rancher still didn't think she knew more than a few words, but in that universal language of gesture and expression. She touched the beaded band she'd made, still tucked in his vest pocket over his heart. Then she touched her own heart. Then his, her palm flat against his chest, feeling the hammer of his pulse beneath his shirt. The rancher covered her hand with his own, held it there. Let himself feel the weight of what she was offering, not just her survival, but her trust, her loyalty, maybe even something deeper that neither had the words for. When they rode out of the canyon at dusk, the warriors were gone. But the rancher knew they'd be watching. Knew that somewhere in the vast emptiness of the frontier, eyes would track their progress, making sure the white man kept his word, kept her safe, kept whatever promise he'd made without speaking. It should have felt like pressure, like obligation. Instead, it felt like purpose, the first real purpose the rancher had known in 3 years. The storm came on the 5th day, rolling across the desert like divine wrath made manifest. They'd been climbing into higher country, following ancient trails through stands of juniper and pinyon pine, heading toward mountains where the rancher knew of caves they could shelter in. But the storm moved faster than they did, swallowing the sky, turning afternoon into premature twilight. The wind hit first hot and violent, tearing at their clothes, filling the air with stinging sand. Then the rain came, cold and fierce, soaking them in seconds. Lightning split the sky in jagged white forks, close enough to make the horse scream and rear. The rancher fought for control, his arms locked around the woman to keep her from being thrown, the horse wild beneath them. They had to get to shelter, had to get off this exposed ridge before the lightning found them or the flash floods came. He spotted a dark gash in the rocks ahead, maybe a cave, maybe just a shallow overhang, but it was better than nothing. He steered the horse toward it, half blind in the driving rain, the woman's fingers digging into his arms, both of them soaked and shaking. The opening led to a narrow cavern, barely large enough for the horse, dry except for where the rain blew in. The rancher dismounted and pulled the woman down after him, both stumbling in the darkness, their hands finding each other instinctively. Outside, the storm raged. Thunder shook the rock. The rain came down so hard it sounded like bullets hitting stone. Inside the cave, pressed together in the dark, the rancher and the Apache woman were alone in a way they'd never quite been before. He could hear her breathing fast and hard from the wild ride, or maybe from something else. Could feel her shivering, her body pressed against his in the narrow space. His hands found her shoulders, steadying her, and felt the trembling that ran through her, felt the cold of her soaked shirt, felt her heart racing against his chest. She tilted her face up toward his. He couldn't see her clearly in the darkness, but he felt her breath against his throat, felt the warmth of her even through the cold and wet. The rancher knew he should step back, should put distance between them, should remember all the reasons this was impossible, the bounty on her head, the killers tracking them, the fact that they came from worlds that had been at war for generations. Instead, his hand moved through her face, cupping her jaw, his thumb tracing the arch of her cheekbone. She leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his, holding it there. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face for a split second, eyes dark and deep, lips parted, an expression of such naked longing that it stopped his breath. The rancher bent his head toward hers, slow enough to give her time to pull away, his intentions clear. She didn't retreat. Instead, she rose on her toes, closing the distance, her mouth finding his in the darkness. The kiss was hesitant at first, questioning, both of them testing this new ground. Then the woman made a sound low in her throat, hunger and relief and need all mixed together, and the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and true. The rancher pulled her closer, careful of her wounded shoulder, his other hand tangling in her wet hair. She molded against him, her good arm sliding around his neck, her body fitting to his like they'd been carved from the same stone. Outside, the storm continued its fury. Inside the cave, in the darkness, two people who'd been alone too long found each other, found warmth, found something worth fighting for beyond simple survival. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, the rancher rested his forehead against hers. His hands framed her face, thumbs tracing patterns on her skin, memorizing her in the darkness. She spoke then soft words in her own language, the meaning clear even if he didn't understand the syllables. She was his now, he was hers. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The rancher answered the only way he could. He kissed her again, softer this time. A promise sealed in the dark while the desert storm tried to wash away everything, but this moment, this connection, this impossible truth. They were 3 days from the territorial line when the ambush came. The rancher had been watching the high ground, had seen the flash of metal in the sun, had known with cold certainty that their luck had finally run out. He'd tried to turn the horse, tried to make for cover, but the shots came from 3 sides at once, a coordinated attack. Professional, the raiders who'd been tracking them finally springing their trap. The first bullet grazed the horse's flank and it bolted, terror-wild. The rancher lost his seat, went down hard, saw the Apache woman thrown clear. She rolled, came up on her feet despite the wounded shoulder, and ran for the rocks where their only chance lay. More shots. The whine of bullets and the crack of rifles echoing off stone. The rancher grabbed his Winchester and returned fire, covering the woman's retreat, buying seconds with bullets. He saw her make the rocks, saw her disappear into a gap between boulders, and felt something loosen in his chest. Then something slammed into his side like a mule's kick, and the world tilted sideways. The rancher hit the ground and stayed down, his hand pressed to his ribs where the bullet had punched through. Hot blood poured between his fingers. His vision swam, darkened at the edges. He could hear the raiders advancing, could hear their voices calling to each other, closing in. He was going to die here. That was fine. He'd made peace with death a long time ago. But the woman, she'd die too, if they caught her. They'd take her back for that bounty, or they'd do worse first and kill her after. The rancher tried to rise, tried to bring the rifle up, but his body wouldn't obey. The world was going gray, the sound fading to a dull roar. Then she was there. The Apache woman emerged from the rocks like vengeance incarnate, moving fast despite her wounded shoulder. She'd found his spare pistol, must have grabbed it before she ran, and she used it with deadly precision. 2 shots, 2 raiders down. The others scattered, seeking cover. And in that moment of confusion, she reached the rancher. Her hands moved over his wound, assessing, her face a mask of fierce concentration. She was talking to him in her language, urgent words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear. Stay with me, hold on, don't you dare die. The rancher tried to tell her to run, tried to push her away toward safety. But she ignored him completely, hooked her good arm under his shoulder, and hauled him upright with strength that shouldn't have been possible from someone her size. They made the rocks together, the woman half dragging him, the rancher's boots scraping furrows in the sand. Bullets kicked up dust around them, whined off stone, filled the air with the smell of gunpowder and death. Behind the boulders, she propped him against the rock face and went to work with hands that knew battlefield medicine as well as he did. She tore his shirt open, packed the wound with fabric torn from her own clothing, bound it tight enough to slow the bleeding. Her face was inches from his, her eyes locked on his face, checking for signs of shock, for the glassy stare that meant he was slipping away. The rancher managed a weak smile, reached up to touch her face, leaving a smear of blood on her cheek. She caught his hand, pressed it to her heart, her eyes fierce with an emotion that transcended language. The raiders were regrouping. The rancher could hear them calling to each other, could hear the scrape of boots on stone as they positioned themselves. 3 left, maybe 4, too many. And he was in no shape to fight. But the Apache woman was. She checked the pistol, 2 rounds left, then picked up his rifle and worked the action. 5 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. She looked at him, and he saw the calculation in her eyes. Saw her making the same choice he'd made weeks ago beneath the scorched cedar. She was going to draw them off, give him a chance to escape. The rancher grabbed her wrist, shook his head hard. She pulled free, cupped his face in both hands, and kissed him deep and fierce and desperate, a kiss that tasted like blood and salt and goodbye. Then she was gone, moving through the rocks like smoke, leading the raiders away from where he lay bleeding. The rancher heard the shot start again, heard her returning fire, heard the hunters become the hunted. She was good, better than good. Every shot she took found its mark or drove a raider into cover. She moved constantly, never staying in one place, using the terrain the way her people had for centuries. But she was 1 against 3, wounded, running low on ammunition. The rancher forced himself to his feet. The world spun, threatened to go black, but he bit down on the inside of his cheek until the pain brought clarity. He picked up the knife he always carried, the one that had seen him through the war and everything after. If he was going to die today, he'd die on his feet, fighting beside her. He found her pinned down behind an outcrop, one raider advancing from the left while another provided covering fire. She was focused on the immediate threat, didn't see the third man circling around behind. The rancher moved on instinct and adrenaline, covering ground he shouldn't have been able to cross. He reached the flanking raider just as the man raised his rifle, and the knife went in smooth and deep, the way he'd been taught 20 years ago in a different life. The raider went down without a sound. The Apache woman spun at the movement, saw him standing there swaying, saw the dead man at his feet. Something crossed her face, relief and fury mixed together, and then she was moving again, firing the last rounds in the rifle, driving the remaining raiders back. In the sudden silence that followed, the rancher and the woman found each other again. She steadied him, her arm around his waist, his blood soaking into her clothes. They stood there breathing hard, waiting to see if more shots would come. None did. The surviving raiders, if any survived, had apparently decided the bounty wasn't worth dying for. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the rocks, fading into the distance. The Apache woman guided the rancher back to their shelter, lowered him carefully to the ground. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline fading, reality setting in. She'd killed men today, saved his life, nearly lost her own. The rancher caught her hands, stilled them, pulled her down beside him. She came, settling against his uninjured side, her head on his shoulder, her body trembling with exhaustion and delayed fear. They sat like that while the sun crawled across the sky, two people who defied every expectation and survived another day. The rancher's wound ached with every breath, but having her warm and alive against him made the pain bearable. As shadows lengthened and the desert began to cool, the Apache woman stirred. She checked his bandages, rewrapped them with careful hands, then brought water and made him drink. Her ministrations were gentle but firm, the same way he'd cared for her in those first desperate days. The circle complete, the debt paid, the bond sealed in blood and survival. That night neither slept apart. The woman curled against the rancher's good side, her hand resting over his heart, feeling it beat steady and strong. His arm held her close, keeping her safe even in sleep, even in dreams. And somewhere in the darkness, carried on the desert wind, came the distant howl of coyotes singing their ancient songs to the stars. The rancher's wound healed slow and stubborn over the next 2 weeks. They'd holed up in a box canyon. The woman had led them to a place she knew from before, from when her life had followed different paths. There was water, shade, enough game to keep them fed. The horse recovered from its graze wound and grew fat on the grass that grew in patches near the spring. In the long, quiet days while the rancher's body knit itself back together, they learned each other in new ways. The woman taught him words in her language. Simple things at first: water, fire, sky, horse. Then more complex concepts: scourge, sorrow, home. The rancher tried to wrap his tongue around the unfamiliar sounds, and she'd smile when he got close, laugh softly when he butchered the pronunciation. He taught her English in return, pointing to objects, speaking slowly. She picked it up faster than he'd expected, her sharp mind making connections, building vocabulary. Within days she could string together basic sentences, her voice accented but clear. It changed something, being able to talk. Opened doors that gestures alone couldn't. One evening as they sat by the fire, the woman touched the beaded band she'd made, still tucked in his vest pocket. She'd taken to checking it often, like a talisman, making sure it was still there. "This pattern," she said in halting English, tracing the geometric design, "is my people's sign for ... protection, for safe journey." The rancher had suspected as much. He pulled the band out, studied it in the firelight. "You made this when you thought you might not make it." She nodded. "I made for you, so you remember." "Remember what?" Her dark eyes met his, serious and deep. "That someone ... believed you were good man. Worth saving." The rancher felt something catch in his throat. He'd spent 3 years believing he wasn't worth much of anything, that the best parts of him had died with his wife and daughter, that all he deserved was this hard, lonely existence on the frontier. This woman, this fierce, beautiful survivor saw something different. He took her hand, laced their fingers together. "Why did those men hunt you?" "The truth." The Apache woman looked into the fire for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "My brother. He led warriors against settlers who took our land, killed our people. The soldiers came. There was battle. My brother died. I was there. They think ... I am him. Think I lead the warriors now. Do you?" She shook her head. "I was healer. I help wounded. But to white soldiers, all Apache are same. They offer bounty. Men come hunting." She looked at him. "Until you." The rancher understood then. Understood that she'd been running not from guilt, but from a crime she didn't commit. From a war she never wanted. From a world that saw her as a target rather than a person. "And you?" she asked softly. "Why you live alone? Why you hide in desert?" It was the rancher's turn to stare into the flames. He'd never spoken about it, not since the day he buried them. But somehow, in this moment, with this woman, the words came. "I had a wife, a daughter. 6 years old, with her mother's eyes." His voice was rough, scraped raw. "There was fever. It swept through the settlements after the war. Took them both in less than a week. I tried ... everything. Nothing worked." The woman's hand tightened on his. "I couldn't save them. Couldn't protect them from something I couldn't see or fight. When they died, I ... He stopped, swallowed hard. "I left. Rode until I found country empty enough that I'd never have to fail anyone again." The Apache woman shifted closer, pressed herself against his side. "You save me," she said quietly. "You protect me. You almost die for me. You not fail." The rancher turned to look at her, saw the truth written plain in her eyes. She wasn't trying to fix him, wasn't trying to fill the hole his wife and daughter had left. She was simply offering what she had, her presence, her strength, her understanding that some wounds never fully healed but could be lived with, could be shared. He kissed her then, slow and deep, tasting the salt of tears, his or hers, he wasn't sure. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "What's your name?" he asked. "Your real name," she told him. The syllables were complex, musical, nothing like the word for starlight he'd tried before. He repeated it carefully, and she smiled, correcting his pronunciation until he got it right. Then she asked for his, and he gave it, the name he hadn't spoken aloud in 3 years, the name that came with a past he'd tried to leave behind. Speaking their names to each other in the firelight felt like a covenant, like becoming real to each other in a way they hadn't been before. That night, they made love for the first time. Slow and careful, mindful of healing wounds and tender places. The woman's hands traced the scars on his body, war wounds, work injuries, the marks of a hard life. The rancher mapped the landscape of her skin, the crescent moon scar on her ribs, the bullet wound on her shoulder still pink and new, the calluses on her palms from a lifetime of survival. They fit together like they'd been carved from the same stone, like the desert itself had brought them together for exactly this purpose. In the shelter of the canyon, under stars older than memory, they found in each other something neither had expected to find again: hope, connection, home. Afterward, lying tangled together in the blankets, the woman's head on his chest, the rancher felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd carried for 3 years, that crushing sense of failure, of not being enough, lifted just slightly. Not gone, but bearable. The Apache woman traced lazy patterns on his skin, her fingers gentle. "What we do now?" she asked quietly. "Where we go?" The rancher had been thinking about this. The territorial line was still 3 days north. Beyond it lay different country, different laws, different possibilities. The bounty on her head wouldn't reach across that invisible border. They could disappear into the mountains, build something new, live quiet lives away from the violence that had defined them both. "North," he said, "across the line. There's country up there, forests, rivers, land nobody wants yet. We could homestead, build a cabin, start over." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Together?" The rancher tightened his arm around her. "Together. If you want." "I want," she said simply, and settled against him with a contentment that spoke louder than elaborate declarations. They left the canyon 2 days later, when the rancher's wound had healed enough for hard travel. The journey north should have been straightforward: follow the old trails, avoid settlements, cross the territorial line at one of the remote passes the rancher knew. But the frontier had one more test for them. They'd been riding since dawn, making good time through high country where ponderosa pines towered overhead and the air smelled of resin and snowmelt. The woman rode in front now, her shoulder healed enough that she could handle the reins, the rancher's arms circling her from behind. They'd fallen into easy rhythms, her body moving with the horse, his hands steady and warm at her waist. The rancher saw the riders first. 6 men, blocking the trail ahead, their horses spread across the narrow path between 2 rock walls. Not the raiders from before, different men. But their intentions were just as clear. The leader sat his horse in the center, a tin star pinned to his vest. A territorial marshal then. Official, legal, worse than bounty hunters in some ways. The rancher's hand moved to his rifle, but the woman touched his wrist, stopping him. She'd seen something he hadn't: more men positioned in the rocks above, rifles trained down on them. A trap, carefully laid, professionally executed. The marshal nudged his horse forward. He was maybe 50, weathered and hard, with eyes that had seen everything the frontier had to offer and been disappointed by most of it. "That's far enough," he called out. His voice carried the flat authority of a man used to being obeyed. "You're harboring a fugitive. Apache woman named in territorial warrants for murder, horse theft, and conspiracy to incite violence." The rancher felt the woman stiffen in his arms. Felt her preparing to fight or run or do whatever desperate thing seemed necessary. He tightened his grip slightly, steadying her, and called back, "She's no fugitive. She's a healer who got caught in someone else's war." The marshal's expression didn't change. "That's not for me to decide. I have warrants. I have orders. She comes with us for trial, or you both die here. Your choice." The rancher looked at the men positioned above them, calculated the angles, the odds. Maybe he could get 1 or 2 before they cut him down. Maybe the woman could make it into the trees if he bought her enough time with his death. Maybe, but probably not. The Apache woman turned in the saddle to look at him. Her eyes were calm, resigned. She'd known this might come. Had probably known from the beginning that the world wouldn't let them simply ride away into a new life. She touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. Then she started to dismount, to surrender herself, to save his life the way he'd saved hers beneath the scorched cedar. The rancher held her tighter. Wouldn't let her move. "No," he said quietly. Just that one word, but she heard everything behind it. All the refusal, all the defiance, all the desperate love that had grown between them. He looked back at the marshal. You want her, you go through me. And I promise you, Marshal, enough of you will die in the process that the rest will think twice about following orders next time." Silence stretched thin and dangerous. The men in the rocks adjusted their grips on their rifles. The Marshal's jaw tightened. Then a new voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding, speaking in the Apache language. The rancher didn't understand the words, but he recognized the speaker. The silver-haired warrior from the waterhole emerged from the trees to the east, flanked by a dozen mounted braves. They moved with silent efficiency, positioning themselves to counter the men in the rocks, their weapons ready, their faces painted and hard. The warrior spoke again, this time in broken English directed at the Marshal. "This woman is of our people, under our law, under treaty. Not yours to take." The Marshal's face reddened. "Treaties don't apply to murderers. She killed no one who did not attack first. This is known. This is truth." The warrior's eyes were flint hard. "You take her, you break treaty. You start war." The Marshal looked at his men, at the Apaches, at the rancher sitting his horse, like a man who'd made peace with dying, but wasn't going to go easy. The math was simple and brutal. He could take the woman, but the cost would be a bloodbath that would echo through the territory for years. After a long, tense moment, the Marshal spat into the dirt. "This isn't over. Those warrants stand. North of the line, your warrants mean nothing," the rancher said quietly. "We'll be across by nightfall. After that, we're beyond your jurisdiction." The Marshal stared at him. "You know what you're giving up? Your own kind will call you traitor, squaw man. You'll never be able to come back to civilized country." The rancher felt the woman's hand cover his where it rested at her waist. Felt her lean back against him, trusting, certain. "I'm already home," he said. The Marshal held his gaze a moment longer, then wheeled his horse around. His men followed, the ones in the rocks scrambling down, all of them pulling back. They'd lost this fight before it started, and they knew it. When they were gone, the silver-haired warrior approached. He looked at the Apache woman, then at the rancher, his expression unreadable. He spoke in his own language, a long string of words the rancher couldn't follow. The woman answered, her voice strong and clear. Then she translated, her English halting but determined. He say, "You keep promise, you protect me, you willing to die for me. This is ... honorable. He give blessing. Say we may go in peace." The warrior reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small, wrapped in soft leather. He handed it to the woman, spoke again briefly, then turned his horse and led his braves back into the trees. Within moments, they'd vanished like smoke, leaving no trace they'd ever been there. The woman unwrapped the leather. Inside was a small stone, polished smooth, carved with symbols the rancher didn't recognize. She held it up to show him. "Wedding stone," she said softly. "In my people's way, he give permission. Give blessing." The rancher took the stone, felt its weight in his palm. It was warm, as if it had absorbed heat from the sun or from the warrior's hand. He looked at the woman, this fierce, beautiful survivor who'd upended his careful solitude and given him a reason to live again. "Marry me," he said. Not a question, an offering. A promise. Her eyes shone with tears she refused to let fall. She took the stone back, pressed it into his hand, then closed his fingers around it. "Yes," she said, simply. "Certainly, yes." They rode north toward the territorial line, toward the mountains, toward whatever future they could build together. Behind them, the frontier, with all its violence and prejudice and impossible rules, faded into the distance. Ahead lay only possibility. They crossed the territorial line at dusk, marked only by a cairn of stones some surveyor had piled years ago. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just the invisible boundary that meant the difference between hunted and free. The rancher felt it anyway, a shift in the air, a lightness in his chest, as if crossing that line had severed the ropes that bound them to the past. The Apache woman must have felt it too. She turned in the saddle to look back at the country they were leaving, her expression unreadable. The rancher wondered what she was thinking, whether she mourned leaving her people's land, whether she feared what lay ahead, whether she was certain of the choice she'd made. Then she turned forward again, settled back against his chest, and covered his hands with hers. And he knew. She wasn't looking back anymore. Neither of them were. They rode until full darkness, then made camp in a meadow where a creek ran cold and clear over smooth stones. The rancher built a fire while the woman tended the horse, both of them moving through familiar routines that spoke of partnership, of shared labor, of lives knitting together. After they'd eaten, the woman reached into the pouch at her belt and pulled out the wedding stone. She held it in her palm, studying it in the firelight, then looked at the rancher. "In my people's way," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "man and woman who wish to marry. They speak promises to each other, to sky, to earth. No one else need hear, just speaking truth from heart." The rancher understood. She was asking if he wanted this, a marriage ceremony here, now, with no witnesses but the stars and the desert wind. No legal recognition, no church blessing, no approval from a world that would never accept them anyway. Just two people making promises they intended to keep. "Yes," he said. "Tell me what to do." The woman rose and walked to the edge of the firelight, gathering small things, pine needles, smooth stones from the creek, a handful of sage. She arranged them in a circle, built a miniature altar of natural things. Then she gestured for him to join her. They knelt facing each other across the circle. The woman took his hands, her grip strong and certain. She spoke first, in her own language, a long string of musical syllables that rose and fell like poetry. The rancher didn't understand the words, but he heard the emotion behind them, heard the weight of vows being made. When she finished, she nodded to him. "Now you. Speak what is in heart. Any words. Any language. The earth will hear." The rancher had never been good with words, had spent most of his life letting actions speak for him. But looking at this woman, at her fierce beauty, at the strength and gentleness mixed in her eyes, at everything she represented, he found the words came easier than expected. "I promise to protect you, to stand with you, to never leave you to face the world alone." His voice was rough but steady. "I promise to honor your people, your ways, everything that made you who you are. I promise to build something with you that lasts. A home, a life, maybe a family, if we're blessed." He paused, swallowed hard against the emotion rising in his throat. "I lost people I loved. Thought I'd never risk that kind of loss again. But you ... You made me remember what it means to be alive, to have something worth protecting, worth dying for." He squeezed her hands gently. "I promise to spend whatever days I have left making sure you never regret choosing me." The woman's eyes shone with tears, but she was smiling, that rare, full smile that transformed her face into something radiant. She leaned forward, kissed him softly, then pulled back and spoke one more phrase in her language. "Now we are married," she translated. "In the way that matters. In the heart." She picked up the wedding stone and pressed it into his palm again. Then she pulled a leather cord from around her neck and threaded the stone onto it, tying it with careful knots. She placed the cord around his neck, settling the stone against his chest, right over his heart. The rancher touched the stone, felt its warmth. Then he reached into his vest and pulled out the beaded band she'd made for him weeks ago. He tied it around her wrist, the turquoise and white beads bright against her bronze skin. "Now we match," he said quietly. Both carrying pieces of each other, they sat by the fire long into the night. The woman nestled in the circle of the rancher's arms, both of them watching the flames dance and spark. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, full of shared understanding and earned peace. Eventually they spread the blankets and lay down together under stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The woman curled against the rancher's side, her head on his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart where the wedding stone lay warm against his skin. "Tell me about the cabin we will build," she said softly into the darkness. The rancher smiled, stroking her hair. "It'll be strong. Stone foundation, log walls, tight roof that won't leak. Big enough for a family, if that's what comes. I'll build you a kitchen with a good stove, windows that face east so you can watch the sunrise. And for you, a barn for the horse, maybe more horses. A workshop where I can do leather work, repair tack. A porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch the mountains turn purple at sunset. Gardens," she added. "I will grow herbs for healing, vegetables for eating. Flowers because they are beautiful and beauty matters." "Yes," the rancher agreed. All of that. They were quiet for a while, each imagining this future they were building together out of words and hope. Then the woman spoke again, her voice drowsy but content. "I think I would like children. Someday, when we are settled. When the cabin is built and life is safe." The rancher's breath caught. He'd lost a daughter once, and the pain of that loss still lived in him like a shard of ice. The thought of risking that kind of love again, that kind of devastating loss, terrified him. But lying here with this woman who'd already shown him he could survive anything as long as they faced it together, he found the fear was bearable. "I'd like that too," he said quietly. "Someday." The woman tilted her head up to kiss him, slow and sweet. "Then we will make it so." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, dreaming of the life they would build in the high country where the old rules didn't reach, and the only law that mattered was the one they made between themselves. The homestead took shape over the next 6 months, rising from the forest floor log by log, stone by stone. They'd found the spot together, a broad meadow backed by pines, with the mountains rising sharp and white to the north, and a creek running year-round through the property. Good water, good timber, good land for growing. And most importantly, isolated enough that visitors would be rare and questions even rarer. The rancher did the heavy work felling trees, hauling logs, notching, and fitting them into walls. The Apache woman worked beside him, her strength surprising him daily. She chinked the gaps with mud and moss, helped raise the roof beams, laid the stone for the fireplace with hands that shaped and placed each rock with precision. They worked through summer and into fall, their bodies growing lean and hard, their hands calloused, their skin bronzed by sun and wind. At night they were too exhausted to do more than eat and collapse into the bed the rancher had built, the first piece of furniture in their cabin, because sleeping on the ground was fine for camping, but not for building a life. But exhausted or not, they always fell asleep tangled together, the woman's head on his chest, his arms holding her close. That part never changed. By the time the first snow fell, the cabin was finished. Not fancy, but solid and warm, with a real roof overhead and a fireplace that drew perfectly. The woman had sewn curtains from fabric they'd bought on their one trip to the distant trading post, had woven baskets for storage, had transformed 4 walls and a roof into something that felt like home. Winter came hard and deep, snowing them in for weeks at a time. But they didn't mind. They had firewood stacked to the rafters, dried meat and preserved vegetables in the root cellar, each other's warmth on the longest, coldest nights. The rancher taught the woman to read, using his few books and the old Bible his grandmother had given him years ago. She learned quickly, her clever mind hungry for knowledge, and soon she was reading to him by firelight while he worked on repairing harnesses or sharpening tools. She taught him more of her language, more of her people's ways. How to read weather and the behavior of birds. How to find water when the obvious sources ran dry. The stories of her childhood, her family, the world she'd left behind. Sometimes, in quiet moments, they mourned what they'd lost to get here. The rancher's wife and daughter, gone to fever. The woman's brother, dead in a war that should never have been fought. The lives they might have lived if the world had been kinder, less cruel, more forgiving. But mostly they looked forward. Planned for spring what they'd plant, how they'd expand the garden, whether they should get chickens or goats. Built a future one small decision at a time. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, the woman came to the rancher as he sat by the fire. She took his hand and pressed it against her stomach, holding it there, her eyes searching his face. The rancher's breath stopped. He looked at her, at the barely perceptible curve of her belly, at the mixture of joy and fear in her expression, and felt something break open in his chest. "You're sure?" His voice came out rough, choked. She nodded. 3 months, I think. Maybe 4. I wait to be certain before telling you. The rancher pulled her down into his lap, wrapped his arms around her, pressed his face into her hair. He was crying tears he couldn't stop, didn't want to stop. Grief for what he'd lost, joy for what was coming, terror at the thought of losing again, hope that maybe this time would be different. The woman held him while he shook, stroking his hair, murmuring soft words in her language. When he finally pulled back, she wiped his tears with her thumbs, kissed his forehead, his cheeks, his mouth. "We will be all right," she said firmly. "We survive everything else. We survive this too, and our child. Our child will be born from love and strength. We'll have good life, safe life. This I know." The rancher wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. So he nodded, kissed her belly gently, and made a silent promise to the child growing there. "I will protect you. I will give you the life I couldn't give your sister. I will be the father I wish I'd had the chance to be." Winter deepened, but inside the cabin, warmth and hope grew like flowers in snow. The rancher stood on the porch of the cabin, watching his daughter chase chickens through the yard. She was 4 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and hair, his stubborn jaw and quick smile. Wild as the wind, fearless as the mountains, loved beyond measure. She spoke both English and Apache fluently, switching between languages with the ease of children who grow up between worlds. Her name was Sarah, after the rancher's first daughter, with the woman's blessing. A way of honoring the past while embracing the future. The Apache woman emerged from the cabin, their son balanced on her hip. He was barely a year old, chubby and happy, already trying to form words, already showing signs of his sister's fierce independence. The woman had named him in the Apache way, a name that translated to "sunrise comes again," and the rancher thought it was perfect. She came to stand beside him, and they watched their daughter together in comfortable silence. 5 years of marriage had settled into their bones, become as natural as breathing. They still disagreed sometimes, still had moments of frustration or misunderstanding. But underneath it all was bedrock unshakable trust, fierce devotion, love that had been tested by fire and proven true. "She'll climb that tree soon," the woman said, nodding toward the tall pine their daughter was eyeing with obvious intent. "I give her 3 days. 2, the rancher countered, smiling. "She's got your stubbornness and my height. Dangerous combination." The woman laughed, shifted the baby to her other hip. "Then you will catch her when she falls. Always," the rancher promised, and meant it in ways that had nothing to do with trees. They'd been found once, 2 years back. A trapper had stumbled onto their homestead, had recognized the woman from old descriptions, had ridden back to civilization with news that the fugitive Apache and the rancher who defended her were living openly beyond the territorial line. A marshal had come, different from the one before, younger, more eager to make a name for himself. He'd arrived with warrants and demands and 3 deputies backing his play. The rancher had met him at the property line, rifle in hand, daughter on his hip, wife at his side. He'd explained, calmly and clearly, that they were beyond territorial jurisdiction, that they'd broken no laws on this side of the line, that the marshal and his men were trespassing. The marshal had blustered and threatened. But faced with a man willing to die protecting his family, on land that technically fell under different authority, he'd eventually retreated. The warrants were old anyway, the crimes half forgotten, the bounty not worth the political complications of forcing the issue. Since then, they'd been left alone. Word had spread that the homestead beyond the line belonged to people who wanted no trouble but wouldn't run from it. The occasional trapper or trader passing through would stop for a meal or supplies, pay fair price, move on without questions. It was all the society they needed. The woman had made friends with 2 Ute families who lived in the valleys to the east. They traded herbs and knowledge, watched each other's children, celebrated births, and mourned deaths together. The rancher had taught the Ute men some ranching techniques, and they'd taught him how to trap beaver and read the winter in the behavior of elk. It wasn't the life either of them had been born to, but it was the life they'd chosen, built with their own hands, defended with blood and courage, and it was good. Sarah spotted them watching and came running, her small legs pumping, her face lit with joy. "Papa, Mama, I see eagle." Big.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.